Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President,
morning business is closed.
Thank you.
Under the previous order, the motion to proceed to the motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked on the motion to proceed to S-1789 is agreed to. The motion to reconsider the vote is agreed to, and the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to S-1789. Upon reconsideration, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 296 S-1789, a bill to improve, sustain, and transform the United States Postal Service.
Under the previous order, there will be 10 minutes of debate, equally divided and controlled between the two leaders of the designees.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, before I proceed to that, I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to urge all of our colleagues to support the pending cloture motion filed by the leaders so that we can begin a debate that will help decide whether the United States Postal Service, this iconic American institution created more than 2 centuries ago, embedded in the Constitution, created in the age of inkwells and quill pens, will survive in the age of email and the Internet. Mr. President, to me, this cloture vote should be an easy one, because if you vote against cloture, you're essentially saying 2 things, I think. One is you don't want to do anything, and if you don't do anything, the Postal Service is going to run out of money and hit its borrowing limit later this year, forcing it to miss payments and necessarily to begin to shut back or close down operations, which is the last thing the country needs at this point. Frankly, the other thing that you'll be doing if you think we should do nothing is to leave the Postmaster General of the Postal Service with an unlimited right to take steps that I believe a majority of members of this body don't want it to be taken precipitously without considering alternatives, and that is closing thousands of post offices around the country, including in small towns and rural areas, and dramatically and quickly cutting back on the number of mail processing facilities, and therefore the standards by which mail is delivered and the speed with which it's delivered in this country. So I hope our colleagues consider this an easy vote, which is simply not to turn away from the crisis that the Postal Service is in. Senator Collins and I, joined by Senator Carper, Senator Scott Brown, we have a substitute that's a bipartisan proposal that I think really will help save the post office, but also force it to begin to make tough, cost-efficient steps to keep itself in fiscal balance. Let me just give you a sense of the scope of this. The Postal Service today, if it were a private corporation, would be the 35th largest company in the United States based on revenue, but putting it just ahead of Apple, and it would be the country's 2nd largest employer just behind Walmart. The 32,000 post offices in America represent more domestic retail outlets than Walmart, Starbucks, and McDonald's combined. These are big numbers, and the post office has a storied history. But today, it's a troubled business, frankly, on the verge of insolvency if we don't act, in part because of the recent economic recession, but mostly because of the transformational impact of the Internet. The Postal Service has had a 21% drop in mail volume in the past 5 years, and of course a corresponding cut in revenue. As more businesses and communications move online, mail volume is just inevitably going to continue to decrease. In fiscal year 2011, the Postal Service took in $65.7 billion, but had expenses of $70.6 billion. This $5 billion loss would have actually been twice that if Congress had not delayed the due date for a statutorily required payment to the retiree health plan that was due at the end of the fiscal year. And incidentally, that followed record losses of $8.5 billion in 2010. This simply can't continue, Mr. President. As I said earlier, if nothing is done, the Postal Service will not have enough money to pay its bills. So please vote for cloture. We've got a good, solid substitute that is a major reform with some due process in it that will make the post office leaner and more efficient. It will dramatically reduce the number of employees and the number of facilities that the post office maintains, but still do so in a way that I think is evolutionary and not draconian either to the Postal Service or in its impact on the millions of people who depend on the post office and will continue to every day. There are a lot of different ideas about how to fix the post office. Some people don't want us to make any changes, and that's the road to bankruptcy. Some people want us to make draconian changes right away, and I don't think that's appropriate. So I ask for a vote for cloture, and I yield the floor. I thank the Chair.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm very pleased to join with the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in urging all of our colleagues to cast a vote for cloture on the motion to proceed to this vitally important bill. Mr. President, there are many different views on how to save the Postal Service, but there can be no doubt that the Postal Service is in crisis. We are at a critical juncture. Without passing legislation, the Postal Service will simply be unable to meet its payroll perhaps as soon as this fall. We simply cannot allow that to happen. The Postal Service is vital to our economy. It is the linchpin of a trillion-dollar mailing industry that employs nearly 8.7 million Americans in fields as diverse as printing, catalog companies, paper manufacturing, newspaper and magazine publishers. These industries and the jobs that they sustain are in jeopardy. If we fail to act, we will deliver a critical, crippling blow to the Postal Service. As Senator Lieberman has indicated, the Postal Service is in crisis. It has lost more than $13 billion just in the past 2 years. First-class mail volume has dropped by 23% over the past 5 years, 12% over the past 2 years. The Postal Service has a debt to the U.S. Treasury of $13 billion and will max out its credit limit of $15 billion this year. We have to address this crisis. It would be irresponsible for members to simply vote no on the motion to proceed if they have other ideas on how to address this crisis. I have urged a full and open and fair amendment process so that members can bring forth their alternative plans for saving the Postal Service. But we simply cannot allow the Postal Service to fail. The stakes are too high for our economy and for Americans across this country. Finally, I would remind my colleagues that the Postal Service's roots go back to our Constitution. This is an organization that is vital to our heritage and to our future. I urge a yes vote for the motion to proceed. Thank you, Mr. President. President, I would yield back the remainder of the time on our side.
And I would do the same, Mr. President.
All time is yielded back. Clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 296 S. 1789, the 21st Century Postal Service Act, signed by 16 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S. 1789, a bill to improve, sustain, and transform the United States Postal Service upon reconsideration, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. DeMint. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk.
He was.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain.
Sorry to disappoint you, John.
Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed, Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Bennett, Blumenthal, Brown of Ohio, Carper, Casey, Coates, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Feinstein, Franken, Grassley, Hagan, Isaacson, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Lautenberg, Lieberman, Lugar, Menendez, Moran, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Shaheen, Snow, Stabenow, Warner, Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Burr, Chambliss, Coburn, DeMint, Inhofe, Johans, Manchin. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Webb, aye. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, aye. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Vitter, no. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Kerry, Aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado. Mr. Udall, Colorado. Aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. No. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo. No. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. No. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad. Aye. Durbin. Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, no.
Okay. I'll do it that way.
Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote on this vote? The yeas are 74, the nays are 22. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative. Upon reconsideration, the motion is agreed to.
Thank the Chair. Mr. President, I move for reconsideration and ask that the matter be laid on the table.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair and I thank our colleagues. It's a very strong vote, which says to me that members of the Senate across party lines understand that the United States Postal Service is a historic and also important part of America's future. It needs to change. It's in the midst of a real and dangerous fiscal crisis. We may differ about how to react to that crisis, but this strong cloture vote says to me that three-quarters of the members of the Senate at least are ready and eager to debate and to pass something that will save the Postal Service from bankruptcy. And the implications that would have for our economy overall, the billions of dollars of our hundreds of billions of dollars of our economy that depend on the mail would be compromised, and our economy and jobs would be further hurt. Mr. President, I hope as the day goes on, obviously with the strong vote for cloture, we now proceed to a 30-hour period of debate on the matter, but I certainly hope that as the day goes on and the members of both caucuses and the leaders talk, that we can find a mutually agreeable path, not to spend the 30 hours on the debate on this motion to proceed, but that we go right to the bill. And at that point, Senator Collins and I, along with Senator Carper and Senator Scott Brown, will file a bipartisan substitute amendment that we have worked on, which we hope will be the pending matter, and then an opportunity for people who have different points of view about how to deal with the fiscal crisis of the Post Office, not to avoid dealing with it. People will have an opportunity to present amendments, and the body will work its will, which is the most important thing. There are too many great national problems that the Congress is not dealing with because of partisanship, because of ideological rigidity, because of an unwillingness to do what has to be done in our system of government, which is to compromise. Not to compromise your principles, but to understand that in a representative body such as the Senate, representing a country as big and diverse as ours, you rarely can expect to get 100% of what you want. And the aim should be to make progress, to get at least 50% of what you want, and to let the other side get some of what they want as well. So I would like to deliver now an opening statement, and then hope that Ranking Member Senator Collins will do the same about the bill, the substitute, which is S-1789. I'm convinced that the substitute will help make the Postal Service leaner, nimbler, and more cost-efficient, while still maintaining the service Americans need to live our daily lives and to keep our economy going. But I want to be clear, this bill alone is not going to save the U.S. Postal Service. The changes around it occurring and within it are too deep. It will represent a very significant step forward. Will save, as the Postal Service, and we will indicate as this debate goes on, save billions and billions of dollars annually and put the Postal Service back on the road to fiscal balance. I view this bill, bipartisan compromise, as a middle way between two different approaches to the fiscal crisis of the Postal Service. One that, to a certain extent, wants to wish it away, to say that really nothing has to change. We just have to find more ways, a different business model. We have to find more ways for the Postal Service to make money, and we can just keep on doing business as we're doing. The end result of that is that either the Postal Service will collapse of its own weight, or the federal government, the taxpayers, will be expected to bail it out. And I don't think that's what the American people want us to do. So one way is to do nothing. The other way is to impose what I would call immediate and a kind of immediate overreaction. Close thousands of post offices, which people depend on across the country. Close hundreds of mail processing facilities, which will mean that people will not be able to get their mail, businesses will not be able to realize the expectation of timely delivery of the mail. And it will have a negative impact on this economy of ours, which still is struggling to come out of recession. We're offering a middle way here, which will provide real and substantial savings from the current operating picture of the Post Office, which is in severe debt, lost more than $13 billion over the last 2 years. But we'll not do it in a way, we'll do it with due process, we'll do it in a way that requires the Post Office to look at every alternative before closing post offices, which are so important to people in most every area of our country. This bill, in other words, is an important beginning, and it will allow the Postal Service more time to continue working with its customers, its employees, Congress, and others to develop a balanced approach to what we needed to do in an age when almost every piece of communication that can be digitized is being digitized and sent over the Internet. But if I may, Mr. President, I'd like to step back and offer just a little bit of history, because we're dealing with a current problem, but there's a rich history here when you talk about the U.S. Postal Service. It's a kind of accidental irony, coincidental irony of the Senate bill numbering that this bill turns out to be S-1789, because 1789 was the year the first Congress under the Constitution was seated, and among the duties of that founding body was the charge under Article 1, Section 8, and I quote, to establish post offices and post roads, end of quote. In fact, in the list of congressional powers detailed under Section 8, creating a postal system comes before the creation of an Army, Navy, or federal courts. That's how important the founders felt this public function would be to our new government, particularly in a democracy, how important communication was, and in a country that had ambitious economic and commercial dreams right from the beginning, that the ability to communicate through a post office would be critically important to commerce and job creation. In the Revolutionary era, it was the post office under the direction of our first Postmaster General, Benjamin Franklin, that sped communications among the members of the Continental Congress and the American Revolutionary Military, as well as delivering letters and newspapers from across our fledgling republic that helped keep the citizens of our new country abreast of events in faraway cities and towns. If you read some of the histories of the Revolutionary War, some of the great biographies done of the founding generation of Americans, that extraordinary and gifted group, you see the role that the post office and postal communications play in their ability to keep in touch with each other, and some of the most important communications that occurred, for instance, between the government and the military. The post office, ever since that early period of American history, has had a tradition of aiding progress and innovation. Maps from the early days of our republic show that many of the roads that we still depend on today, and if I may be parochial, I'll cite I-95 in Connecticut and a lot of other places along that path, are still follow, in some cases are built on top of the old post roads. The job of maintaining Samuel Morse's first telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore was entrusted to the post office, and it was a former Postmaster General who helped Morse expand his transformational network of telegraph and telegraphic communication to other cities in our country. But that network grew slowly, so to keep our nation connected with its frontiers, way out in places like Montana, I might say, to the occupant of the chair, the post office helped sponsor the Pony Express. That was a great early example of what we talk about a lot but don't do as much as we should, public-private partnerships. Pony Express filled a necessary gap in communications until the telegraph finally spanned our nation coast to coast. And the post office's subsidies for airmail in the early days of aviation helped jumpstart the fledgling airline and air freight industries, which of course we all depend on so much today. I won't repeat what I said in my statement about the scope of the Postal Service today when I spoke earlier on support of the vote for cloture. But I just will repeat saying that if the Post Office were a private corporation, it would be the 35th largest company in the United States, just ahead of Apple. That's by revenue. And it would be the country's second largest employer, just behind Walmart. 32,000 post offices across America. That's more domestic retail outlets than Walmart, Starbucks, and McDonald's combined. But perhaps because of some of that, certainly notwithstanding it, the post office is today a troubled business, and I want to speak honestly and directly. It's on the verge of insolvency if we don't act. Part of the problem more recently is obviously the impact of the economic recession we've through, but the big problem is one that's not going to get better, and that is business loss to the Internet has led to a 21% drop in mail volume in the past 5 years and a slump in revenue as a result. You'd have to be unrealistic to say anything other than that this trend is going to continue and that mail volume will continue, first-class mail volume will continue to decrease. As I mentioned, $13 billion that is deficit in the last 2 years, running a deficit in the last 2 years when the Postal Service, would $5 billion more if Congress hadn't come along and delayed the due date for a statutorily required retiree health care pre-funding payment that was due at the end of the last fiscal year. This simply cannot continue. That's why our committee, this is one of those bills that comes along not because you're excited about doing it, but because you got to do it. Because if we don't act, I repeat, two things are going to happen. One is that the Postal Service, either the Postal Service will become insolvent and begin having to literally cut back its operations, or two, the Postmaster will use authorities he has under the current law to close a lot of post offices and mail processing facilities and cut back service. And I know members across party lines don't want that to happen precipitously. So let me now describe some of the major parts of the substitute bipartisan bill that's come out of our committee. The bill includes two measures that will relieve some of the immediate financial pressure on the Postal Service. The first is based on an Office of Personnel Management determination that the Postal Service has overpaid its contributions to the federal employee retirement system by roughly $11 billion. Call it a misunderstanding, call it a clerical error. It is fortuitous for the Postal Service in the trouble it's in, and our bill directs OPM to refund this money to the Postal Service and then directs the Postal Service to use this money to provide retirement incentives to employees and to pay off some of its debt. Let me explain what I mean about those incentives. S-1789, the substitute would direct the Postal Service to use part of these refunds from the federal employee retirement system to reduce its labor costs, which make up about 80% of its budget. There's no way the Postal Service is going to get back in balance without continuing to do what it's been doing, tens of thousands, reducing the number of employees it has. But the aim here is to do that as a result of a voluntary buyout program. The fact is that approximately half of the Postal Service's current workforce is eligible for either full or early retirement. If 100,000 workers took advantage of the program, which is below the full amount eligible, the Postal Service would save $8 billion a year. That's the single most significant saving item in the package that we bring before you today. And we set a goal here, which is that the Postal Service should aim to reduce its workforce by this incentivized retirement program by approximately that 100,000 workers, or 18% of its current workforce. Our bill also reduces the amount the Postal Service must pay into its retiree health benefits account over the next 40 years. The current formula or schedule of payments was part of postal reform passed some years ago. We conclude that the payments required are larger than is necessary to sustain the viability of the retiree health benefits plan. So we mandate an updated amortization schedule based on projections of what will be needed to fund postal retirees' health care in the future, not just an arbitrary number. And that, we think, means that the Postal Service is likely to see a significant cut in its annual $5 billion bill to pre-fund retiree health care, which, of course, would take further stress off the Postal Service's annual operating budget. We expect, as this debate goes on, to have as close as possible of an exact projection of how much that change would save from the Postal Service itself. Now, let me talk about some of the proposals that the Postal Service and the Postmaster have made that have been most controversial. First, Saturday deliveries and canceling most Saturday deliveries. Postal Service has said that it can save $3.1 billion a year by canceling Saturday deliveries to individual homes and businesses. Not something you want to do, but if you're looking to get this institution back into balance and keep it alive, it's one of the things that we're probably going to have to do. The Postal Rate Commission agrees that ending most Saturday deliveries will save a lot of money, but says their estimate is $1.7 billion a year as opposed to the $3.1 billion that the Postal Service estimates. Either way, we're talking about a substantial reduction in costs, and one that we may have to face. Our bill recognizes that ultimately it may well be necessary to switch to 5-day delivery. I'd say it's going to be necessary, personally, to switch to 5-day delivery, but we require the Postal Service to follow a path over the next 2 years before that significant step, 6 to 5 days, is carried out. They first got to determine, according to our bill, if the other cost-saving measures in the bill have made canceling Saturday service unnecessary. We can hope that that would happen. I'm skeptical that it will. If a 5-day schedule is deemed necessary, the Postal Service must then submit a plan to Congress, the GAO, and the Postal Rate Commission on how it plans to cushion the negative effects on the businesses and communities it serves. GAO and the PRC will then submit their own studies to Congress on this matter. If the PRC, Postal Rate Commission, and the Comptroller General conclude that the change is necessary to allow the Postal Service to achieve long-term financial solvency, then 2 years from adoption, the Postal Service will implement a 5-day delivery schedule. Now, what about the closing of post offices, which has created a lot of concern really all across America in response particularly to the Postmaster announcing a list of 3,700 post offices that are possible candidates for closure. And one of the things we found in response to this is exactly what I found over the years in Connecticut. People have the local post office is not just a place where mail and packages pass through. It becomes a local institution of community significance. And it's hard to convince people that they should be closed. People are attached to their local post offices, not just in small towns and rural areas, especially there, but in a lot of other places, including cities, neighborhoods and cities in a state like my own state of Connecticut. But the reality is we can't afford to continue to have as many post offices as we do operating in the way they do. Our bill would improve the present law covering post office closures. It doesn't prohibit them, but it requires more public participation and due process, and requires the Postal Service to issue comprehensive retail service standards to ensure that communities throughout the country have access to retail postal services if their current post office needs to be closed. In other words, look for ways to consolidate retail postal services. Perhaps put the retail postal service in a state or local government office building. Perhaps put it in a retail establishment, or Walmart, or whatever, to make sure that the service is maintained in a more cost-effective way, even if the local post office is not. Perhaps incidentally, the bill does also require that the Postal Service take steps before closing a post office that it does not now have to take, including offering a community these other kinds of options I've talked about, such as keeping a post office open with more limited hours, or permitting private contractors or rural carriers to provide the services that the local post office is now providing. Another one of the controversial proposals that the postmaster has made is to close 232 of the current 461 mail processing facilities, not the post offices, but the places the mail goes to be processed so it can get from where it's sent to where it needs to be delivered. The truth is there's excess capacity in this system now, and the post office has to eliminate some of that excess capacity. However, the bipartisan substitute proposal basically requires that care be taken, so this is done in a way that does not compromise service standards necessary to maintain the current customer base. In other words, we gotta reduce expenditures, but if we do it precipitously, as some of our colleagues I think will propose amendments to do, the net effect is that less people are going to use the post office because they're not going to get the service they need, and as a result, the revenues will drop and the problem will be even greater. The substitute amendment therefore permits the Postal Service to eliminate some excess capacity in the mail processing system, but again requires the Postal Service to maintain a modified overnight delivery standard, a bit reduced from what it is now, but still there, particularly for the local delivery areas. The maximum standard delivery time, most people probably don't know this, the Postal Service accepts a maximum delivery time of 3 days for a letter mailed anywhere in the U.S., in the continental U.S. In other words, you mail a letter anywhere in the continental U.S., it's got to be delivered anywhere else in the continental U.S. within 3 days. That will remain unchanged, and the Postal Service would be required to maintain a sufficient number of processing facilities to meet those delivery standards, but could otherwise close unneeded facilities. Now, so far I've talked about the cost side of the ledger. S-1789, the substitute, also gives the Postal Service tools to bring in fresh revenues by offering new products and services, such as specifically authorizing contracting with state and local governments to issue state licenses, authorizing for the first time the Postal Service to do what some of the private shippers do, shipping beer, wine, and distilled spirits, authorizing the post offices to provide notary services or to provide specialized Internet services. Our bill would also create an advisory commission of prominent citizens and charge them within a set period of time to reconsider the Postal Service's current business model and provide it with a strategic blueprint for the future that will enable it to both continue to exist and provide the services that people want, but to do so in a way that balances its budget. Mr. President, these reforms, and finally it creates a Chief Innovation Officer whose aim, self-evidently by the title, is to continue to find ways to innovate, to build on not only the constitutional responsibility to maintain the Postal Service and post offices, but to do so in a way that is innovative and builds on the irreplaceable assets that the Postal Service has, particularly the capacity to deliver to the last mile anywhere in this country. Mr. President, these reforms are necessary. They will make the Post Office smaller and more cost-efficient. As a result of this bill, there will be fewer employees at the Post Office and fewer facilities. We just have no choice but to bring that about. But this bill will keep the Postal Service alive, and I think it'll keep it well, and it'll put it on the path to surviving forever, but in a different way, because the environment in which it's operating, because of the Internet, simply has changed. Despite its shrinking stream of posts and parcels, here's the reality that we're dealing with and what would be affected if the Postal Service had to begin cutting back its operations. The Postal Service still delivers 563 million pieces of mail every day. 563 million pieces of mail every day. Only the Postal Service, for the price of a stamp, will go literally that last mile to ensure delivery to every business and residence in America, using burros in the Grand Canyon and snowshoes in Alaska, doing whatever is necessary to make that happen. What federal agency, if I can go to another one of the services the Postal Service has been giving, could process, if you know, you think of the unthinkable that the Postal Service closed, it could process 6.7 million passport applications a year if the Postal Service wasn't there. These are just some of the examples and suggestions of the fact of what's possible, but also proving that the Postal Service is not just a relic of the 18th century, it's a pivotal part of the 21st century, and we've got to act to make sure it survives. The computer age poses unique challenges, and the day may come when we're going to send and receive all our mail, get most of our magazines and books, and pay most of our bills on electronic devices that are reliable and secure. But honestly, the day will never come when we can send physical things across the Internet between homes and businesses, things like medicine, clothing, household and business supplies, even spare parts for those computers we're using so much. So the Postal Service is unique, and its network of support facilities and dedicated employees, I think, stand ready to deliver to every home, store, and business and factory in America. That's why we've got to act to make sure that it continues to be able to do that. Let me go back to that first Postmaster General, Benjamin Franklin. Always had a lot of good things to say that seem relevant centuries afterward. And the one that comes to mind today is when Franklin said, "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. End quote from Franklin. This bill offers preparations to succeed, to make sure that the Postal Service never fails. I thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
The senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous